Hey everyone, Elia here. This is an episode that I recorded back in December 2025. I may actually do these on a yearly basis with the same people, probably. I've had them on back in, I'm not actually sure when, I think it was 2023, talking about Ariel, Kroon, Luka, Dowell, and Andre, aka Hydroponic Trash, to talk about Solarpunk. At the time, the title was From Capitalist Realism to Solarpunk Realities. I also did separate interviews with each of the three, so that's like three different episodes of the Friday Sounds that you can check out if you want as well. This time around, so like last December, we sort of decided, at least like I proposed to them and they kindly agreed, that we take this opportunity, given everything that's happened since the first time we recorded, well, the first time we all did it together, so like in almost 3 years now, reflecting on Solarpunk, or what rather how our feelings, our views, attitudes towards Solarpunk may or may not have changed since then, given everything that's been happening. And I thought it would be an important episode. I thought it was an important episode to do because one thing that I want to keep on doing with the Friday Times, and I admit it is difficult, is to maintain this sense of hope as a discipline. And I take it very seriously. It's really one of my core tenets, if you want, core philosophies, that hope is indeed a discipline, that it doesn't always feel good. In fact, maybe most of the time it doesn't, but that there are real reasons as to why it is necessary nonetheless, beyond just, if we wish it, therefore it's more likely, because that's not quite how I think. But it's still something to adopt, something to take seriously, something to engage with. Let's put it that way for now. So yeah, this episode is being released now, a few months later, unfortunately. That's just how things are. Before I let you listen to it, I just wanted to share a few admin stuff very quickly. I will soon, inshallah, hopefully, I'm thinking in the next month should be feasible, release a new subscription model for those of you who listen to both the Friday's Times as well as read my newsletter, Hauntologies. I will have a separate audio release, as in like in a separate episode on the Friday's Times, explaining all of this at some point, hopefully in the coming weeks. What I will say is that anyone who is already supporting me on Ko-fi.com, you'll find the links in the show notes, with a monthly donation, you will get automatic access to all of the things that I will be publishing behind a paywall. So the Friday's Times will continue as is. They're going to have the episodes. That's not going to change. They're going to be largely interviews. The monologues, more and more of them will be behind the paywall. And that's for two reasons that I hope will be understandable. The first one is we live in capitalism and I just need to find realistic ways to make a living. So that's like one thing. And I think that's reasonable, as much as it pains me to say so. The second reason is that a lot of the monologues that I will be reading out loud will already have been available as in written format. So essentially, I'm adding a dimension to the existing work, which is why I think it's fair to ask for like financial support from those of you who can afford it, and those of you who can't, you have the text available online usually anyway. The audio recordings would not usually just be me reading them. I would also be adding comments. That's sort of the idea, and reflecting upon them. In fact, one of the monologues that is, as of now, available on this feed, on the Friday's Times, the actual text that I read was like, 8 minutes or so, but then the comments were like half an hour, So that's how it's going to be. More and more of these will be behind a paywall. I may release like a preview version of them on the public feed to encourage people, to redirect folks towards the subscription model. To hopefully, the end goal obviously is to make this into a sustainable thing. I've been doing it for 6 years. I love doing it. It's just the way things are, the reality of the situation, the fact that capitalism isn't going away anytime soon. I still need to find ways to maintain this project for the long term. And this project includes both Hauntologies, the newsletter, as well as the Friday's Times. So anyway, all of this to say that if you already support me on Ko-fi, again, link in the show note, or if you're interested in doing so, you will automatically have access to all of this. So think of your support on Ko-fi as kind of an investment in this project. As soon as it's up and running, you will just have access to all of this. You don't need to do anything else, anything new and stuff. The classes on Lebanon, the third one is already happening as of time of recording. We did the first Saturday. I'm still accepting late entries. If you're interested, just send me an email at Ayoub@defythesetimes.com or send me a message on Signal at Ayoub.02. Links in the show notes as well. Obviously, you won't have access to the first one. You may even miss the second one, but you'll have access to number 3, 4, and 5, the third, fourth, and fifth sessions, and our audio recordings for the first, for all of them, for that matter. In fact, anyone who joins the classes has access to the audio recordings of all of the classes. So by the time this is done, this would mean 15 different audio recordings. And the next class is one that I will announce at some point. I haven't quite decided yet. I'm trying to take things a bit slower now because I've been quite overwhelmed and struggling with burnout. And not to mention that, I don't know if you can tell from my voice, but I've been also like physically ill for a few weeks now. I'm better, so don't worry or anything, but thanks in advance for your thoughts. And besides that, did I forget anything? No, that's it, really. Yeah, I miss doing this, folks. I wish I can do more of it. Hopefully with the new subscription stuff, I will manage to do more and more of it. Obviously the ideal will be to do this full time. Like, I'm actually physically able and emotionally willing to do this, like to release an episode every other day if I could help it. But they take a long time to produce, to research, to edit, and most of the time I do all of these steps on my own, including the nice designs you see on the website, which at this point is just because I enjoy doing it more than anything. I don't want to start doing things via AI, and I won't. And this is just the unfortunate realities that a lot of people are doing so these days. I'm not even judging them for it. I'm just saying that's just how it is. I feel personally that something very fundamental is being lost in doing so. And I personally intend on, for however as long as the Fire These Times continues and Hauntologies continues, I will not use AI, period. I just won't, and I don't want to, and that's it. Others people do, and I'm not going to judge you for it or anything. It's just something that personally I feel there's a real loss there somewhere that I don't always know how to express, but I sincerely feel it. And yeah, all of the links in the show notes, the coffee stuff, you'll be supporting me again doing this for however long I can manage, and I really hope to do so until for the rest of my life. So you could easily have an investment, like a small investment of $5 a month, or you can pay the yearly thing, which I think there's a discount if you do so, and you're kind of helping making this project into a potentially decades-long one, which would be interesting in and of itself. Anyway. As always, folks, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being here all these years. And I will see you, well, maybe you will hear me rather soon. For those of you joining the classes, I will see you soon. And that's it. Take care, folks.
My name is Ariel Kroon. I'm located in Kitchener, Ontario, Southern Ontario in Canada, on the Haldimand Tract, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Chononton peoples. And I am a co-host of the podcast Solarpunk Presents, which is currently, as I am speaking, in winter 2026 on hiatus. We're very much hoping to bring it back very soon. But life has gotten extremely busy for both of us right now. So, and I live with chronic fatigue. I'm currently working at Wilfrid Laurier University as a research associate / project manager. And what else? We recorded the 100th episode, so you might remember my voice from then. And I was also on the panel from the first Solarpunk conference on oh gosh, what did we title it? It was something to do with capitalism.
We threw around so many titles.
I know.
I think it's From Capitalist Realism to Solarpunk Realities.
Yes, exactly.
Which is a cool title.
Yeah. Very cool. All right. And that's kind of it for me. So take it away.
Awesome. Andre?
Hey everybody, Andre Zario here. Online, I use the pseudonym Hydroponic Trash. I'm a hacker, a writer, and in general, tinkerer and DIY weirdo. Do a lot of projects, do a lot of writing. And yeah, Ariel, I've been on the same boat. I've been super, super busy. Life has been lifing hardcore, and just trying to balance living without burning out, and kind of my experience with burning out over the past year, and what that looks like, and kind of living in a very chaotic time and trying to maintain hope and what that kind of looks like. So right now, I've been working on a piece with a bunch of different academics about permacomputing, which is kind of tangentially related to Solarpunk. It's about, technology and the effects that it has on the ecology, and questioning like how we can rethink our use of technology when it comes to the natural world and society as well. So it's a interesting kind of development in technological thought. And right now I'm kind of working on a fiction book, a larger collection of some of my short stories into an actual book. And I kind of want to explore a lot of the ideas that I've had about Solarpunk and kind of put it together with contrasting with kind of like a cyberpunk world with a solarpunk world, and trying to think about utopias and imperfect utopias. What does life actually look like? So yeah, that's a little bit about what I've been working on and what's been happening with me.
And are you still calling us from Texas, I think, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, I am based in Texas, so a lot of fun stuff happening here. A lot of not fun stuff. So,
thanks, Andre. And Luka?
And I'm Luka. I host the Solarpunk Now podcast, which sort of on trend with what other people have mentioned, was on hiatus for a while, and I was really burned out. Life has been lifing. I'm trying to come back to it because these ideas I think are honestly more important than ever, and I'm still, through the burnout, I've still been processing and thinking through things, and I'm excited about some upcoming research I have. I'm going to do an ethnography of the Solarpunk community. So I'm fielding, I have a survey out right now for people who are interested in potentially being interviewed for that. And I've also been doing a sort of interdisciplinary literature review thing, looking at the social scientific research on climate communication, what makes communication effective for like motivating people, and how that aligns with solarpunk fiction, which I think has a lot of the same features of effective climate communication. And let's see, the last time we talked, I was in the Los Angeles area, but I'm now based in the Bay Area. I'm married now. It's been a very exciting year. Yeah, there's a lot going on personally for me and in the world right now, and that can be very exhausting and overwhelming, but I think spaces like this are so important, and no matter what it takes, I'm gonna keep putting myself out there and getting involved.
Well, I'm happy to have the three of you on again. Last time we did an episode we were checking this earlier, was in 2023. And I think as Ariel mentioned, I think we recorded that the summer of that year. So it's been a minute. And since then, boy, have things happened.
You contacted us in December about doing this at first, and things have really happened since December. We're living in almost a different world than, or at least I am definitely over here. So things are happening very fast.
Yeah. The kind of the topic of this episode, in the sense of the meta topic, I don't know, but is reflecting on our relationship with Solarpunk, given everything that's happened since the last time we spoke. So let's say in the past 2 or 3 years, a lot has happened in my life since. I mean, I literally have a kid now. who is 2+ something years now, 2+ years and 4 months or so. That has definitely, like, whatever concerns I had about the future is like on steroids now compared to before. But conversely, at the same time, it's also reinforced this need to not lose myself in doom and gloom, to not like just an instinct that I like my anxiety speaking, basically, like that instinct kind of just being there, basically, and not to let it dominate. Occasionally let it run its course, and by it basically it translates itself into either burnout or like, I need to take a step back from things or whatever it might be. But yeah, as we've been saying, a lot has happened. It's just one of those things that I think basically everyone's gonna who listens to this knows that, oh yeah, of course, a lot has happened since. But how do we flesh that out in the context of Solarpunk is kind of, I think, what we will try and explore here. And I'll start off this conversation by saying that I've been thinking more and more in recent months, and I have an essay that was published. When the fuck was it published? Let me check. A few months ago, with the New Internationalist, called "The Stories We Tell," that explored specifically, and that's definitely. I mean, it was already there when we did our episode, but that's a big, again, on steroids kind of thing, like the whole big tech co-opting popular sci-fi, fantasy, Lord of the Rings in case of Thiel, and Musk calling himself a Trekkie, and that sort of thing. And so in that essay, I explored that. And I then did an interview on this other podcast a few weeks ago called I think it's called the Political Philosophy Podcast, talking about that essay. And one of the questions I got was, why does it matter to talk about fiction and stories in general? And I think if I remember correctly, it's weird quoting myself or paraphrasing myself, but I said, like, there's a quick answer and a long answer. And the quick answer is that it matters because clearly it matters to them, like those guys, those billionaires. That's like one way it matters. And the other way it matters is that if we think about climate anxiety, and of course, in the context of global warming, climate change, like, climate scientists have been the ones reaching out to people outside of that field. And in my case, it was Julia Steinberger who wrote one of the IPCC reports. And we ended up doing like panels together and everything because she identified this early on. And I think now it's better understood than it was then, to be fair, that there is a serious problem when it comes to climate communication, because it never was enough. And since then, it's, still not enough to simply say, things are bad. We need to stop doing the thing, and if we don't, things will get worse. I mean, I'm bastardizing a bit, but generally speaking, that's been the instinct.
Yeah.
And throwing facts at people and whatnot, that's sometimes works, often doesn't. And I've been wanting to understand why it doesn't, and this is what brought me to fiction. And that's the kind of the thing in many ways that links us together, I guess. So that's been where I'm coming from, and I'm rereading Lord of the Rings, which I haven't done in 20 years, partly because I knew that the way it's being talked about by the Thiels of the world is wrong, but I wanted to know why it's wrong, if that makes sense. Like, I knew it, I remembered, but like not in detail, and that pissed me off. So now I'm rereading it, and I'm just enjoying it in the process anyway. Anyway, so that's been my approach, or that my angle to it. What's been your angle? And just feel free to chat, and so we don't have to raise our
I
hand.
mean, I'm really resonating with what you're saying. Just as someone with a PhD in English literature, I'm like, well, of course stories matter. It's how we as humans make sense of the world and of things that go on around us. Our brains are continually making up plot lines and storylines, and to figure out our place in well, not only to figure out our place, but then to figure out what it is that we should do next. And I think a major failing of climate communication is the fact that it's been all stick and no carrot. It's been, like, this is bad and we should stop doing this. But it doesn't tell us, okay, but now we should start doing this other thing. It's like that. It's like, I don't know. I have two cats. I can't tell them not to do something and then not give them another thing to do. So I can't tell them to, like stop scratching my furniture and not give them something else to scratch, because otherwise they're just going to keep scratching the furniture, right? Because like the action is still going to happen no matter what, but we can channel it to more productive sort of ends, or we can continue down sort of a more destructive path, which is sort of, that's how I've kind of been thinking about it. And I, like, I think I wrote a blog post a long time ago. It was on sort of climate change and mental health, and it was kind of saying like the thing with climate anxiety and climate depression, how articles in the news that have to do with heavy subjects like suicide tend to have at the bottom, like a list of places that you can call and resources that you can use. Climate anxiety articles, anything to do with the climate, there is no resource. It's just kind of like, here, have some bad news, and now you get to sit with it forever. And no wonder people are feeling very despairing and unable to do anything, because they haven't been given that that prompting to do something. And I think that's where Solarpunk comes in and is able to sort of give that nudge and give that imaginative expansion of kind of like, oh, there's other possibilities for how to do things. We can do things another way. So I kind of see Solarpunk as really helping to sort of move that along, I guess.
I really like that point about news articles not having any resources to call at the bottom. I remember pretty vividly, I don't remember the publication, but a recent article about I believe the North Atlantic current slowing down or being signs that it's weakening. And the facts presented in that situation is something like, this current that shapes global climate in like so many important places in the world, very, very populated areas, may just stop. It may just stop by around like the 2030s or something, some estimates would say. And I'm sitting there like, okay, how am I as one person going to stop this giant ocean current of water?
Yeah,
or
it's like,
get
okay,
it moving again?
What do you want me to do about it?
Yeah.
Like, why are you telling me this? I can't do anything, So
yeah. And
seems, yeah. Sorry.
That's why my mind has also been, on the fiction lately, and what the connection is between fiction and reality. And I feel like that's this unbridgeable gap that we're always oriented around as people interested in Solarpunk. And lately that's taken me to sort of a comparative analysis of Solarpunk fiction versus, the elements of good climate communication, which includes things like you have to also show the solutions. You have to show people doing the solutions. People don't actually respond well to just a list of facts. It's much better if it's oriented around the problem-solving actions that people are taking. So, you don't just get a PSA that says, hey, colon cancer is a thing. You get a PSA that says you should get a colonoscopy starting at this age. Like, here's how you do that. Like, it's structured around achievable action. And, for something like an individual person having cancer, that's a very individual achievable goal. To go to a colonoscopy facility to do the proper steps for that's something we can think about. We can fit that in our heads. We can't really fit the steps required to take climate action in our heads, but it still puts us on the right track to be thinking about action-oriented stories. And I think that's something that Solarpunk and Hope Punk and all these related genres just really have in abundance. I mean, any fiction, the thing that we gravitate towards is like really vivid depictions of people doing things together, sort of the relationships and conflicts that come up. That's all just really juicy stuff for us. And it makes me think of a prompt that I think originally we had in mind for this conversation, which was the idea of hope as a discipline. And that immediately made me think of of writing as a discipline. There's also a lot of conscious effort that goes into writing any story, whether it's a hopeful story or not, but separating hope out, moving away from it being some sort of just affect or feeling, some sort of passive thing that sometimes we have or sometimes we don't, and thinking of it the same way that a writer has to consciously sit down every day, whether they want to or not, and start putting words on the page. We have to sit down whether we want to or not and think about how the world should be and how we get there.
Yeah. I mean, to me, fiction definitely points us towards directions of where we would want to go, where we don't want to go. It's definitely pointing out the possibilities or the probabilities of what can happen, you know, in ways that we're not really thinking about or ways that we're not really planning. And that's kind of how life works. There's a lot of probabilities and possibilities out there, and the chaos of the world can kind of make some of these things happen and make some of these things not happen, and I think that some of the tech players at play, some of the people who, hold power at this moment, understand that deeply, and that controlling kind of the narrative that we have about the future, our conceptions about reality, can create a reality that people, want to see, whether that's positive or negative. But a lot of what I've been thinking about for the past, year, 2 years has been optimism, pessimism, and hope, and kind of the differences and balances between those. I think like hope is deeply tied into fiction because it's important to have hopes and dreams, because without dreams, we never really have a future, right? We repeat things over and over and over again. I really think that dreams, hope, and fiction create the new possible realities, and the only way to make those possible futures a reality is kind of through actions. But in order to act, we need to think, we need to dream, we need to speculate, and imagine what's possible and make it probable.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there can be any action without first having thought of that possibility before. I mean, it's just a basic function of how humans work. It's like you can't do a thing unless you think about it first. Well, I guess sometimes you can, but this is like the knee-jerk sort of like lizard brain reactions, and often you find yourselves apologizing for those. So, taking action after measured thinking about it, I think is a wise way for a lot of solar punks to kind of move through the world and take up this, hope as a discipline, like you were saying, Luka, instead of just letting hope be sort of a feeling and I guess hoping that you feel hope, instead making it into sort of a piece of your reality is something.
I of course love all of what you just said. And I'm thinking one of the ways I've found it useful to talk about, well, the stories we tell and the reason why this matters is sort of, so when I get that question, when I'm imagining someone thinking those thoughts, because I mean, I'm not alien to them either, is trying to flip it on its head. What does the opposite of that look like? Are we saying that we don't live through stories and everyone just has a factual, or let's say, rational response to a facts-based assessment to reality, whatnot? And of course, humans don't function like that. One of the things that Solarpunk responded to early on, and one of the things that led to Solarpunk in the first place, is a reaction to these post-apocalyptic futurisms that depict the world in a, not just as in bad things have happened, but that people react badly to the bad things that have happened. And despite the fact that case study after case study and example after example this proves that, not that things are always amazing or anything, but people usually come together when shit hits the fan in one way or another. So certainly when it comes to I don't know, there's a fire or there's people usually want to help because it's a natural human instinct to do so. We're communal animals and so on. But despite that, despite books like, I don't know, Rebecca Solnit's book or so many other studies or whatever it might be, the idea that it doesn't take much for humans to do whatever and for this to become a dog eat dog world, which I've mentioned this joke many times, but I'm gonna say it again, like dogs don't even do. It's weird that that expression exists, and I don't know why it bugs me, but anyway, despite all of that, like despite the many, 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 many examples of how, sure, there are problems, but overall, people do come together, mutual aid tends to pop up in one way or another in certain in these situations, certainly the ones I have in mind. It's still this overwhelming sensation, this feeling that many people have, and again, I'm not alien to it myself, that like when things get bad at the global level, it's inevitable that they're going to get worse until something like what we've seen in the movies or whatever, like whatever that like line is, like when you cross it into it, like everything becomes like the fucking purge or whatever. And that tends not to happen in like that. You have it in context of war where you have like a dominant group that tends to take it out on a civilian population, let's say, as is in the case of the Sudanese genocide or obviously Gaza or whatever it might be. But those are contexts of state powers doing these actions, or state-backed groups in the case of Sudan, not individuals for the most part, how they interact with one another. But so that's how I flip it on its head. But then the other thing I would, and that's the whole stories we tell thing, is then if it doesn't matter at all, why are we constantly making up stories about what we think is possible and what we think is not possible? The whole realism, the question of realism is something I've been questioning a lot, and I want to write an essay about this at some point. And obviously, I mean, with Luka, we did the capitalist realism episode on Mark Fisher and whatnot. And for those who don't know, it's this idea that essentially that there is a limit to what we think is possible, even in people who consider themselves like anti-capitalists. It's like we don't. I'm bastardizing how to explain it, but like almost like we don't really believe that it is actually possible to live in a world that does not have capitalism. That the best thing we can do is to fight it and hope for the best, but ultimately we're kind of just tweaking it or alleviating maybe the suffering or whatever it might be, and so on and so forth. And I've seen this across the board since like something clicked when after like getting to terms with capitalist realism. There's so many other types of realism, including of course when it comes, which is linked to capitalist realism anyway, when it comes to global warming. I've read article after article, interviews after, and as soon as there's the word realistic that pops, it's like something like triggers an alarm in my head. And the last thing of that nature, and then I'll end on my point here. There was an interview in the Financial Times, and I wrote about it on a newsletter, that they interviewed the guy who was the head of COP28. I don't remember his name, which was in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai. And he was also the oil guy of UAE. This was like one of the first, most blatant examples of cooptation at the COP level, which since then has only gotten worse in many ways. And he described himself as an energy realist, and he used that term. And that bugged me, of course, and so I wrote an essay about it and stuff. But that is a very, very common thing. There's a contrast between, like, it tends to be a right-wing argument, but many centrists use it as an American. People on the left, maybe not voluntarily or consciously, let's say, but it's still a thing that we can't be too, quote-unquote, unrealistic. Yeah. Even when the science itself is saying we need to be doing X, Y, and Z, but saying we need to be doing X, Y, and Z at the political level, that's when you get then the accusations of being unrealistic. And there's something missing there. And that's what interests me in a sense.
That energy realism is the route that the Canadian government is pursuing right now when it comes to energy and oil in the Alberta tar sands. It seems that all of well, not all of them, but a good chunk of the climate change reforms that were put into place under the previous government have now been rolled back. And we've got, environment ministers quitting and stuff like that. Well, I don't think it was environment minister. I think it was a minister of something else. Anyways, so, the whole idea of being realistic, again, I think about, like, according to whom? Who is dictating this reality to us? And why are we choosing to be part of this reality? I mean, besides the obvious answer of if you choose not to live in this reality, then people tend to just not want to talk to you. entry, kind of funny. But yeah, I mean, tying it back to solarpunk fiction, I know, especially in the beginning, with solarpunk fiction, it was a lot of, far future, sort of like fantastic scenarios. And I think that solarpunk has been sort of, I guess, stereotyped as being unrealistic in that way. Like it's inspirational, surely. It's something that people really like and are drawn to, but at the end of the day, is it realistic, right? And I mean, like I would argue that about like there are many solarpunk stories that are about the transition between our world and to a more solarpunk future. They're harder to find though. The main I think the main solarpunk imaginary is this quote unquote unrealistic vision. And so that tends to trip people up, I think. Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think it's really interesting that we can see Mad Max as more realistic than Solarpunk.
Exactly.
It seems like realism is just like such a contested space right now psychically. It's this area where ideology is so, I don't know. It feels like a very contested space. It feels like there are a lot of different cultural influences kind of competing. And at this point, I can't believe anyone who says the word realistic without qualifying it in some way. Like what are you talking about? Realism or justifying, or like there's so many ways to use the veneer of realism or rationality to explain your position in a way that leaves out all these other realities, all these other potential arguments that could be made. So I'm just kind of not concerning myself with realism at this point, frankly. That's why I really like the idea of hope as a discipline. I would love to be able to practice something every day, whether I feel like it or not. I'm trying to work out more. That's the same principle. Whether or not my heart's in it, I know it's the right thing to do, and I'm going to take small steps every day to orient my life in that way. And that, going back to this idea of thinking before acting, that's absolutely true. The best strategic actions have to be, planned, analyze. We have to analyze the situation, figure out what levers to pull, where to put our efforts. But at the same time, our actions also shape our thinking. So it's sort of this chicken egg thing, or, maybe a virtuous cycle is a more productive way to think of that, where a little more directionality to it, right? Yeah. The psychology of identity building right now suggests that the way we become the people we are, the things we take for granted, the things that feel realistic to us are shaped by the little steps we take every day. They're shaped by the sort of, I guess you could think of it as virtue ethics or the behavior side of things, the actions we do every day. And then we do create stories. We retroactively create these stories to justify why we do things, even if we aren't thinking about them first. So to me, I think that's a really powerful mechanism to latch onto. While we need to think through the actions we take, it's also really great to create spaces where people can act without thinking and then develop their thought through that. Like going to a protest, I think, is a great example. The barrier to entry is very low there. You just show up and then you leave with this feeling of community and this feeling of like, I want to learn more about what's going on. I want to see how I can get involved. It's sort of a catalyst for further thought and further action.
Yeah, I think this point about realism is kind of if we look at the emotions behind it, it's kind of a fight between pessimism and optimism. And a lot of the realism or the realistic outcome is usually a pessimistic one. But I would say that like blind pessimism and blind optimism are two sides of the same coin, because they both say that something is inevitable. right?
Mhm.
So like if you're blindly optimistic about things, things will work out regardless of what we do, regardless of what kind of actions we take, or individually or collectively, things will work out in the end, which means, hey, some people kind of take that as I don't need to really do anything because things will work out, I'll leave it to other people to take action. Things will eventually work out. And then on the flip side of that, blind pessimism is, the world is shit. It will always be shit. All the outcomes are bad, so why even try? And I think a lot of outlooks on the realistic quote unquote side of things is, things are going to continue to get bad. This is just how the world works, and you should just do nothing and accept the fact that life is going to happen and bad things are going to happen. But I think, to me, like, hope is kind of in between that, where it's kind of admitting that, yes, on the optimistic side, yes, we can think about these possible futures, but they aren't concrete.
Mm-hmm.
It will require some action behind it. It will require some thought. It will require some attention. It will require some dreaming about what we can do, but it's not a concrete thing that all this will work out. But on the flip side of that, it's also kind of an admission that, just because things might not work out does not mean things will not change. And even if we're taking steps to move into like a perfect solution, to a perfect idea of where we want to go, even if we don't get there, it's still the fact that we've moved from point A to point B, and we're continuously hoping and thinking and imagining, well, what does point C look like? So I think a lot of times we get stuck into we didn't achieve this goal. Let's throw it all away. Well, no, we like the steps were taken towards that goal, and even though it wasn't like completely achieved, we're now at a new starting point for something else, So yeah, I don't know. It's weird that everything kind of boils down into being extremely pessimistic, but it's kind of a way to fight that is kind of have a balanced optimism about what can happen. Things are never inevitable. Things can change.
Mhm. Just because something is the most likely outcome doesn't mean that it is now set in stone, Like it's, and even that, it sounds like while we were talking, Andre, I was thinking like it sounds like realistic, like this narrative of realism is a narrative that is created by people who have already swallowed the pessimistic worldview, the way that they make sense of the world and themselves within that world is through these pessimistic stories, like what Elia was talking about when like these post-apocalyptic stories, and
Mm-hmm.
even though there's so much evidence against it, that people come together in disasters and help each other and stuff like that, and that does not make for a very good narrative. That is not interesting. People are not going to pay money to go to the cinema for that. And so, and it also appeals to the fact that just as like humans are kind of wired to consider all the bad things that might happen so that we can avoid them, Like it's kind of an evolutionary thing. Like, we like our brain just like goes over and over the bad stuff because it wants us to stay away from it. But at the same time, then it sort of creates those like neural pathways where we're more likely to think about bad things as being more likely to happen. And so,
And to
yeah.
and to immediately, once the, let's say, good things happen, not to internalize them in the same way as when the bad things
Mm,
happen.
yeah.
One, I mean, I have my lot of issues with the current government of Canada, as Ariel, I'm sure, would agree. It's also true that like they were not supposed to win. The Conservative was supposed to have a dominant whatever, and then Trump opened his mouth, and suddenly that entire reality changed.
Yes.
Here in the UK, just a
Thankfully.
few days ago, a few days ago, a seat was won by the Green Party, which at this point is basically the left-wing party in the UK. And it's this been described left and right, not literally left and right, but as in the press, as being an unlikely thing to have happened because Reform, i.e., the far right party, were the favorites and stuff. And again, the questions is who, like, if the numbers proved it wrong, as in the Greens got like a size, they got like 40% or something, and the Reform got 29%. So that's not even like a small error. What was it about that situation that so many people, especially in the media, interpreted it as being well unlikely that the Greens would win? If the Greens did win, in an ideal world, let's say, this would trigger a sort of series of questions that like, what did we get wrong in thinking that this was unlikely? Because like based on what, right? In the end, and I'm thinking of there was this report that was released about a month ago, well, in January or so, kind of a security assessment by the heads of intelligence here in the UK. And it was only released semi by accident because there was a freedom of information request by like a Green Alliance, whatever they were called. And so then the media got hold of it and started talking about it. And even the report that we have is not the full one, it's like a censored one and whatever. And it's a report by MI5, MI6, and whatever the third one is, because there's a lot of them here in the UK. And that basically identified global warming as a national security threat.
Ooh, I heard
by
about
saying
that.
by saying things that are pretty straightforward to anyone who just has followed trends and just, I don't know, knows stuff about global warming and the environment and stuff. Like one of the, for example, I opened it in front of me, like ecosystem that, and here I'm quoting, ecosystem degradation is occurring across all regions. Every critical ecosystem is on a pathway to collapse. And then this presents a threat to, quote, UK national security and prosperity. And then the world is already experiencing impacts, including crop failure. And again, listing things that climate scientists have already been talking about. But what's been interesting about that report is the report in and of itself, as someone who's like, I'm not an environmental scientist. I have some STEM background and I can read the literature and I have climate scientist friends. I can tell you confidently is not particularly, I don't know what the term is, advanced or sophisticated. It's just things that are in reports produced by climate scientists. And at this point, they are almost intuitive, like enough people, assuming you have a good enough understanding of what's happening, you know most of what's written in that report. Then kind of a few things happened after that. The report was released. And of course, there's a bit of the controversy of, and I'm saying a bit because nowhere near as much as there should have been. Because so much other shit is happening at the same time in the UK, of like how the Labour government censored that report. They did not want it to be released, and it was a freedom of information, as I said, action that released it to the public, and not even in its full version. But then the other thing that for me is interesting that was not, as far as I could tell anyway, talked about much or if at all, is the assumptions that are made in that report. And this is where, for me, it gets interesting because, heads of intelligence, supposed to be the most, unemotional, detached, cold, hard facts people. These are people who, whatever, people have seen movies. They're so cold, they're so detached, they are beyond the petty emotional stuff or whatever it is. And yet, in the report itself, there are assumptions such as, and I highlighted one of them, conflict and military escalation will become more likely, both within and between states, as groups compete for arable land and food and water resources, end quote. Now, I'm not saying this won't happen. I'm saying it's normal for a state body to conclude that because that's what states often do. It's not what humans, individuals, tend to do with one another. And this is like Hobbesian logic. Fast forward whenever he died a few centuries, you have it in that report. That's it. There's no like that much variation. And that for me is, I hope I'll have the mental space to write about it at some point or cover it in one way. But that to me is an example of how there are lots of assumptions that are made of what is more likely and what is less likely. For example, the thought that even the idea that maybe there is a possibility that all of these different groups affected by a global problem can actually come together to resolve it together is not part of the report, because that's like an emotional thing to say. That's a hopeful thing to say. Oh, well, I'm putting these in scare quotes, people can see me. But no, if you want to be the cold, hard fact person, as Andre pointed out, effectively you have to be the pessimistic one. And again, I'm not saying bad shit won't happen. I mean, bad shit is happening, and I'm saying bad, good here just to simplify a bit. But assuming that it is more likely, tends to be a projection of current trend and what has already happened, especially in the near, not too distant past, and projecting that into a future that ultimately, this is one, and I'll end on this note. This is one of the interesting things with these reports, is that sometimes they will give you like very far away dates. Like they will tell you by 2100s, which isn't that far away, but like by 2100s or by whatever, because further than that, basically, we don't know much. And even then, of course, these are estimates and projections and whatnot. But they will talk about the likelihoods of the futures, and as though once something happens, like it's a done deal, like once shit hits the fan, shit has hit the fan, and now you have to be Peter Thiel, and this of course how he thinks, and you go to your bunker in New Zealand, and that kind of logic permeates this entire thing. And this is what really I want to challenge and question and get annoyed at, and all of these things when it comes to these realism things, because people who call themselves that say so usually without much pushback, either because the journalists who are interviewing them don't have the tools or whatever it might be. And I think it's having this, I mean, among other things, kind of these repercussions that we read this, and if sorry, I'll end on this note. If I'm imagining like, not me, but like, let's say someone I know who might be persuaded by that tendency, reading the interview in the Financial Times with that cop guy, the Minister of Oil, or whatever the fuck his title was, probably a Minister of Energy or something. You're not a climate, you don't deny climate change or anything like this, and maybe we can get into the actually lots of different ways in which one denies climate change. You see yourself as like I follow science. I'm a fact-based person. I know this is bad and something must be done. But you have this like person of authority and whatever it might be saying that like I am an energy realist. And if you accept that term, that effectively means that climate scientists saying that we need to do something are energy, whatever the opposite of idealists. We would all love to have whatever, but it is unrealistic. Anyway, I'm repeating myself a bit, but these are the things that have been on my mind, let's say.
Yeah, I wonder how much. No, I have a couple of thoughts. Number one, though, is we've been talking a lot about realism, and I wonder how much it is that people say that they are being realistic or thinking about realism when really they mean they're being practical and they're thinking about things that they can put into practice. So, and that I think ties into the idea of the imagination, because like, for example, that example of what the I don't know, the threat document from MI5 or whatever said, like there's this likelihood of war and fight over resources and stuff like that, because that is something that they have seen happen. We have seen it happen. We know how it happens. What we have not seen happen, or we have only very rarely seen happen, so we're not as familiar with it, is people coming together to solve a problem. Like, I can think of the example of like, the Kyoto Protocol for the ozone layer, like that's sort of the one big example of countries at that level coming together. But then even at the, like at the neighborhood level of people just like sharing what they have with their neighbors, as opposed to, like getting, like really possessive over water and stuff like that. And I wonder how much that realism is dictated by this lack of practical opportunity or ability to imagine practical solutions that are positive, because that's not something that we've allowed to be part of our imaginations for a very long time. I mean, like, or that's not something that we're very good at turning into compelling fiction. I don't know. I think that solar punk fiction is definitely going that way. But again, like there's a lot of like it's a very young genre and a lot of, short stories and fragment fiction and stuff like that. And we're building towards something, but it's it hasn't been quite enough to sort of, I guess, reach into that, like that realm of the practical and the, like quote unquote realistic, basing what we think can happen on what we know has happened before. So the future is dictated in a way by our past experiences. And so it's not really the future if we're only ever thinking about the things that have happened and projecting that as the only things that can happen in the future. That's not real futurism. That's just trying to perpetuate a version of the past sort of forever, which is terrifying when you think about it. I'll stop now.
I really appreciate this distinction you're posing between realism and practicality or pragmatism. I think like as you sort of hinted to, I think sometimes when people just, sort of an average person, not a minister or a head of getting these reports together, but your average person working for a living is probably saying when they say they want to be realistic, they're probably saying, I'm trying to make a living, I'm trying to provide for my family.
Yeah.
Like I can't solve this myself. And that seems fairly realistic to me. Like if there is something worth recovering about what people mean by realism, it's that things are hard and we're tired and scared and like the science of climate is physics. It's happening. That seems pretty inarguable. It is a really tall order. I mean, the fact that we have to keep having these conversations about like, is it possible to recover a sense of hope? Is it possible to organize and do anything? It's because all of these things are not a given. There's no guarantee that things are going to improve or get any that will make any sort of progress on dealing with these issues. And I've been reading a book recently called Utopia in the Age of Survival by S.D. Christoska. And there are a lot of really interesting reversals and switchbacks. It's critical theory. It's very hard to read. It's been a journey trying to get through this book, but there's also a lot of really valuable, interesting ideas. And one thing she presents, I guess an overarching goal of this book is for her to recover the utopian tradition for like the modern left, the era that we're in right now, where it seems like we're kind of afraid of it or not, we have this feeling that it's just not realistic. We need to leave it behind. It's time to get down to brass tacks, be more realistic about things. But Christoska argues that utopia as a tradition of thought has never been about what we expect to happen. It's not about these most likely high confidence, medium confidence, these sorts of ways that things are framed in reports of the science. It's a thought experiment. It's a practice of, okay, what if we actually did intentionally intervene? What could we intentionally improve or change? What are the things that we can pull on and affect? It's not at all about what will most likely become of the world. That's maybe how we get the more dystopian stories if we're just sort of imagining existing trends continuing forever. But utopia is this sort of intentional practice of intervention.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Andre, I know that you're next, but I just have a quote I want to because yes, I'm a nerd and I did write down a quote for this. But Luka, when you were talking about this like fear of utopia and stuff like that, then that just reminded me of this theorist Jose Esteban Munoz, who I quote a lot because I really like him. he wrote in a book called Cruising Utopia, the then and there queer futurity. And so this is what he says, quote, this fear of both hope and utopia as effective structures and approaches to challenges within the social has been prone to disappointment, making this critical approach difficult. As Ernst Bloch would insist, hope can be disappointed, but such disappointed needs to be risked if certain impasses are to be resisted. A certain effective reanimation needs to transpire if a disabling political pessimism is to be displaced. The eventual disappointment of hope is not a reason to forsake it as a critical thought process, in the same way that even though we can know in advance that the felicity of language ultimately falters, it is nonetheless essential. End quote. And I was like, oh, that's so relevant. Just the idea that we're so, like worried about, I guess, hope because we don't we cannot see all ends, hope, that's kind of the definition of hope, right? Is that it's not guaranteed. So
yeah, hope exists kind of in the unknown or the interstitial, the possible. So it's really hard to interact with it, and it's hard to interact with too, because our societies right now are so based on survival. A lot of people are living their day to day in basic survival mode, and it's hard to live your life in survival mode and be thinking about what are possibilities in the future, because that pessimism can start to really cement itself because you're so used to the way that things are going that, hey, this is the way that things are always going to go, but that's not necessarily true. There's a quote from Byung-Chul Han in his book The Spirit of Hope on page 14, I think. He says, hope is a catalyst for the new, incipit vita nova. Here begins a new life. And on the same page, he kind of goes through and encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about, like survival and change. He has this quote, there is no revolution through fear. The fearful submit to domination. Revolution can only come through a hope for another better world. Today, revolution is impossible because we can't hope, because we're paralyzed by fear, because life deteriorates into survival. So if we're stuck in this lens of constantly trying to live, it's a lot harder to take that step back and have enough time and mental resources to think about change, to think about possible futures, to think about possible realities, and grasp with that kind of unknown of, could this work, could this not work? It doesn't really matter. It's a possibility on kind of on the future that could happen. And just because pessimism has been kind of central to a lot of people's thoughts, to me, I think a lot of the change will be in moving people from pure pessimism to kind of a balanced optimism, and giving people room and space to imagine and dream.
You see, just to bring back friends of the pod, the MI5 and MI6, if you don't see, okay, I'll put it this way. They mentioned, as I said, conflicts are getting, they'll get more likely, and another way of concluding of understanding or reading their report is that, therefore, we as agencies, our role are going to be even more important than they currently are. This is where, if you don't know how to read ideology in texts that are supposedly neutral, then they seem to be neutral. That's how they're perceived. If the conclusion was things are going to get more difficult, but thankfully we have this documented evidence that people do come together, and that's a good thing, and we need to maybe figure out as a nation, as a community, or as a world, or whatever, to how do we hone those skills? How do we develop mutual aid networks and all of that stuff? you would also have to conclude, and also therefore, an entity like MI5 and MI6 is not needed in that world. In fact, may cause more damage than good. In fact, they're in, etc., etc. And then you'll have to embed your own destruction as part of the logic of what you're writing. In what you're writing, of course, they won't do that. And that's the whole, like, that's where it gets, that's the realism aspect of things. It can be like cartoonishly obvious when it's like, I don't know, an oil lobbyist or sorry, let's say an oil company saying, we want to fix things, but we cannot do it immediately, so we want to be part of the solution. That's like cartoonishly obvious, at least I would say to people like us here. It still works in a way, and that's I think Luka, you mentioned it, like the point of like action and the kind of the chicken and egg situation. One thing that does work in the sense of how lobbyists and how the oil industry has succeeded in many ways is in is is in creating further distance, let's say, between the thought that everyone supposedly who's educated, blah blah blah, knows that like what needs to be done and what can be done in the immediate present. It's constantly pushed to the future, to like and I had to take a flight recently, and one of the things that always makes me laugh in Arabic we have this expression like in مضحك مبكي, like what is funny is sad, like, and what is sad is funny, therefore kind of this both at the same time. Is they have like, please don't throw away your plastic cup because we care about the planet, and like the hotel thing, like if you don't want to reuse your towel, whatever it might be, because we want to save water and stuff like that. Or no, my favorite thing of all, and there's something I saw in France. If you go to them, the petrol station of like the Total one, the main company, the main oil company, they boast that like a lot of those stations themselves are solar powered. So like the shop, and whatever, and that's like, if it didn't have a purpose, if it didn't help their bottom line of maintaining oil production, they wouldn't be doing these things as well, and that's where the stories come along. It's not like we're no longer the old guys. Those are the old. We don't like those guys. Those are the old guys. We're no longer these oil guys. We are the everything guys. We're realistic, quote unquote, enough that we can tell you we're not gonna lie to you. I'm pretending to be an oil exec here, that we need like fossil fuels and whatnot. But we're not anti-solar and anti-wind. But these technologies, they're no. So like, let's stick to what we know for now. And this feeds very well into whether it's an election cycle, whether it's like, for example, here in the UK, every fucking winter there's some kind of energy crisis in one way or another, and that creates a whole series of like headlines and discourses and what gets lost in all of this is like, what if we don't do that? What if we say the energy crisis, we don't need it. We actually can figure it out. Let's say we can. Let's be wild kids for 5 minutes, and let's be crazy enough and say there is a way to resolve it. What would it take? The good news is that not much, for the most part, structurally speaking, I mean, in the sense that the technology is kind of there. I'm simplifying a bit, but certainly more feasible, let's say, than what this whole realism things would suggest. And that's why for me it gets interesting, and also keeps me going a bit, because otherwise, again, there's the whole doom and gloom thing. There's a whole like, it's a kind of this hyper object. It's too big. It's everywhere. And most people, at least in my like, granted, there's more people these days also like have fallen down conspiracy theory holes and all of that stuff. But most people, for the most part, don't do that necessarily. But that doesn't mean that they're not, or we are not, I'm gonna blame anyone here, but like, we're not still kind of part of the problem in one way or another. In the sense that, as I mentioned a bit earlier, like, climate denial is not just the cartoonish version of like, there is no global warming, or CO2 is actually good and whatever. Like, those are like the blatant ones. It's also this, what tends to be called these days as realism, as energy realism. As like, yes, of course, I mean, it's sad that we're destroying the rainforest because of AI or whatever. And of course, it's weird and whatever that, or unfortunate, let's say, that AI is, the data centers are consuming so much water and energy and so on. But, and this is where everything follows after that. And my point, and I mean, I don't think anyone disagrees sincerely, but is to try and show that like what follows the bot is ideology, is not quote unquote realistic. It's not realistic in that sense, you know. It's realism in the ideological sense, but not in the maybe non-ideological sense. And I'll stop on this rant. But yeah, it's what's been
Yeah.
keeping me up at night at times.
No, that's a good reminder that like these, possibilities that we are presented with are always going to be shaped by ideology. And it's
Yeah.
like nothing is without bias. Everything by virtue of the fact that it's written by a human being, the words are going to be chosen from a certain viewpoint. And, like even if the person thinks they are being the most unbiased thing possible. So yeah, I mean, the, you know, oil companies rebranding themselves as energy companies, right? And making it so that the narrative is, we cannot switch off of fossil fuels right away completely. Like, what about all the sterile instruments in hospitals? Those are going to need plastic. You know where plastic comes from? Oil, like that sort of thing. You're like, okay, yeah, that does kind of make sense, I guess, but also like there are alternatives. And then when people ask you what the alternatives are, you say, I read something, I think, because they are not, they're intentionally not promoted. And we do not come across these like alternatives as normalized because yeah, there's vested economic interest in keeping things the way that they are, which is not great. And I see I see the role of Solarpunk as, like honestly, even well, Solarpunk fiction can just get people to like, at its very basic, just question the narrative of like this is inevitable. Like there are no other ways to be doing, like whatever it is. Solarpunk fiction can, at the very least, get someone to say, oh, hey, I never thought about that as a viable solution, but now I do. And so when that comes up, if it comes up in the news, like it's that there's one more person who is a little bit more amenable to that, the idea of like solar power or hydropower or wind or whatever. But when it comes like, but I'm talking about like, this is a very, very small individual changes. When it comes to changing the entire narrative, that dictates sort of corporate interests and the way that we deal with the global and complex problem of climate change, I really don't know. I sort of wish that, like there was a way for solarpunk fiction to be uh uh I guess impactful at that level, but it doesn't seem it is.
Mm. I So we're coming up to time more or less. Like I have some thoughts. I'll share them now. Won't be too long. And then maybe what we can do is have like a round or whatever, and then we'll close it off. Um, one of the things. So okay, I interviewed three folks, including two friends from the FTP collective, which this podcast is. They're from the Periphery, which this podcast is part of. Who are in Minnesota, who live in Minnesota, and obviously we're talking about the anti-ice stuff and the resistance there and so on. And one thing that I thought about while having that interview, while having the conversation, which I thought about after recording, which is very inconvenient for a podcast, is how a lot of people in Minnesota, like the Twin Cities and Minnesota more broadly, who are not necessarily, I don't know, radicalized, I don't know, like committed lefties or whatever it might be, like normies, as to use internet parlance here, still showed up for their neighbors and still took the ice wash training and did all of these things. And for me, what's very interesting, and that's where part of that, the motivation to do that specific episode came from, is what motivates someone who didn't see themselves as like particularly quote unquote political to do something that is quote unquote political. because for me it's like as interesting, if not more interesting, to figure out in a way how to dismantle the false binary between something that's political and something that's apolitical, and as something like the world of politics being kind of a realm over there, and one becomes like a political scientist or a political analyst. And I'm not saying these are useless categories, but one of the issues with those, especially the analyst bit, is that it creates this obstacle, which I experience myself as someone who is that. When I get asked by, I don't know, my father-in-law questions about the news, quote unquote, or the world, especially if it comes to the Middle East or whatever, he talks to me as though I know the thing that he doesn't know, and that what I'm going to tell him is unquestionable. This is just what it is. And of course, I can try and be as accurate as I can and whatnot, but I am a person. I have my own biases. I have my own things I'm missing or whatever it might be. But in his mind, like, this is a thing that's happening over there. It requires whatever. And I am personally not, like him in this case, not directly connected to the thing. And one of the challenges that I think Solarpunk tries to address, and I mean, it's still a very young movement in many ways, is how do we reduce the distance between what feels possible and what feels not possible, let's say. I don't know if that made a lot of sense. But that's sort of where, as I mentioned a few times, that's sort of where my head's been at. Like the first thing that came through my mind when I read the report of the MI6 whatever thing, is not even like, oh my God, this is a big deal. Because again, most of these things, we all of these things actually, that's the actual facts there are known. There is the element of like the outrage that the government tried to censor it, especially so to speak center-left government, which isn't quite so center-lefty. And also in my mind, like also how there's been virtually no popular outrage at this news. But what's been very interesting, and that's what I mentioned, is how even in the report itself, it has limitations, because there is no such thing as 100% pure objective in this case. And also the way it was talked about, including by like environmentalists and people who like have whatever, like I share their politics for the most part, or whatever it might be. Still this, I think, still to this day, inability or whatever it might be, or maybe people are not tuned to think in these terms because they're not familiar with Solarpunk, whatever it might be. Like, what are the things in that report that they get wrong, not for purely scientific reasons, but for like human reasons, the assumptions that they make, and why are we still there, despite the fact that, again, evidence, stories after stories and case study after case study shows that this is not, for the most part, how humans react when shit hits the fan. It tends to be how states react. But then there is the question of like, we're therefore assuming that this model of human organization that has existed for roughly 2 centuries, not even, for the most part, is going to be the thing as well that we'll have in the next century, in 2 centuries, in 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that this is just going to be the way things are. And as much as history tells us no, things change, and as there is still this inbuilt and very difficult to dismantle it assumption of what the future is going to look like as a projection, for the most part, of what either the recent past has been, or maybe the present is, or whatever it might be. And Solarpunk for me is one of those tools that can make it easier, I can just put it that way, facilitate the process through which people then start thinking about this as a concrete, feasible present, like it can actually happen in the present. And then the question is, what do we need to do to make it, to get there, in that sense. I'll stop on that.
So throughout the second half of this conversation, I've been thinking about the word survival. I heard it mentioned a couple times, and so that the impression of the oil lobbyist there was very, very scary. But what it had me thinking was like this guy is thinking about his own survival. These organizations, governments, corporations, when they put out a report that sort of assumes their presence as a given throughout time, that's a report that's in their best interest for their continued survival. That's why these oil companies do want to figure out how to rebrand and transition into a new era of the economy. But what we're facing right now is a question of our own survival. Like at this point, the survival of humanity, of the people, is not guaranteed. So we have to be confronting that with the same level of seriousness. What does our persistence through time look like? How do we ensure that our communities will survive what is, based on the physics, based on what's already happening, what the challenges that we're going to be presented with now and in the near future. I just want to end on, I don't know, I feel the need to tell people it's okay to not be hopeful right now.
Mhm.
And part of me wonders, how many different kinds of hope are there? How much is hope culturally dependent? I can't really answer these questions, but I do think that there are many different sort of emotional places, that emotional and cultural perspectives we're bringing to these conversations. And it's okay to not feel good about where things are or where they're going. But I would encourage people to find spaces to practice hope, or to practice optimism, or some other word you want to use, organizing, maybe. Find ways to make regular space for that in your life, to engage in this process of identity building and moving away from experiencing the climate crisis as an individual emotional experience, because that is a very dark place to be. But organizations and movements are built through relationships. I spent some time reading Miriam Kaba, who I think is associated with this phrase, hope as a discipline.
Yeah.
And she's done a lot of writing on that. And I really like the idea of moving away from narratives to relationships, thinking about our struggle as relationship building and learning how to work through conflict together, rather than just individual activism. We're trying to organize, and organizing requires other people that you're accountable to, that, you hold them to account as well. And ultimately, this isn't about expecting to see a change in our lifetimes. I think that's maybe we need to expand our time scale a little bit and be thinking about the world that we're creating for our kids and for future generations. And it's okay to not expect to see the change in our lifetimes, but what we can do is organize the relationships around us and have an effect on our communities, and create the sorts of cultural waves that do ripple, that do over time change larger structures. And I think art and cultural work, as Kaba writes about, like, cultural work is a part of organizing, and it is this sort of longer term undercurrent that I think needs to be present in the more immediate actions, that should also be happening, like neighborhood networks to resist immigration agents, for instance. I kind of see like a parallel path here, where there's the slow cultural work and the everyday getting together, taking action. I think those can really segue well together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think narratives, fiction can change our own emotions. I mean, even thinking about it, like, since you brought up, survival and realism, I feel like they're connected to emotions. Like you said, there's people who are doing actions because they care about their own future existence, they care about their own lives, they care about their own their own lives and how they're living. We should definitely do the same. And I think that fiction and hope in general can allow us to think more about some of the emotions that are behind the reasons why we take actions. Ultimately, like, when I think of Solarpunk, I really just think of empathy and compassion for people and the environment, and that's kind of like the driving force behind, when people help each other it's not because of some kind of material gain. It's usually because we're compassionate to other people. I think most people have empathy for other people. And I think that's going to be a real driving force to change is keeping an empathetic view of not only ourselves but with the environment as well. And that's really how we survive, is through empathy. And I guess long term, how do we make some of these big things happen? It's really hard for us to conceptualize massive change on a large scale, but we've seen it happen when we're kind of leading with being empathetic to each other. And I think a lot of large scale political movements can lean more into understanding the fact that the way to communicate with people isn't always the factual basis, but also the emotional. And that emotional stuff kind of ties into art, music, literature, because that, to me, definitely influences people at a deeper level when they understand, the reasonings on why we have to think about our own survival when it comes to climate catastrophe is because it's going to affect all of us. And if it's going to affect all of us and you're empathetic to the people around you, the way out of it is through cooperation. So I think with large scale change, definitely changing the narrative behind the reasonings why we do things can push things in the better direction.
Yeah. Luka, I liked what you said about not pressuring people to feel hope right now. I think hope can seem to some people to be a very big thing. And like I said, with survival right now, everybody's just trying to survive. Our lives can be very small, and reduced to, a very sort of I don't want to say bare life, but just a very struggle to survive where you don't really have the capacity for more things. And hope can feel kind of like a luxury that you can't have when you're trying to make ends meet. And I think that then, it's helpful to, yeah, practice hope as a discipline. And so maybe instead of trying to feel hope, just taking hopeful actions. And what is a hopeful action? Perhaps it is just an action that helps your neighbor, that strengthens that relationship, that it's prompted by what Andre was saying, that empathy for other people. And so it doesn't necessarily you don't really need to feel hopeful to still be helpful, It's not like you don't have to feel like a fraud if you're, trying to, change the world, but you don't actually have any hope that you can change it for yourself. There's a Haudenosaunee principle called the seventh generation principle. And it's a philosophy that the decisions we make today should result in sort of a more sustainable world, sustainable relationships with people 7 generations in the future. So these, your children's children or whatever. Or if you don't have children, then basically the generations that are going to make up society in 7 generations. And so hoping for those people might seem more holding hope for them might seem more of an achievable goal. Because it might be difficult to see a way through what's going on right now, personally within the time span of your life. But within this sort of larger expanded time span, it might be easier to dip your toe into hoping for something, the arc of history bending towards justice. Yeah, I really like that. No pressure for hope right now. It's great if you can get it. I think Solarpunk teaches us how to hope, and how to take those sort of hopeful actions, if not have the feeling ourselves.
That makes me think of kind of the civil rights movement and how a lot of people think that it was the 1960s and then all this stuff happened and then all of a sudden there was civil rights for Black people in America. But it was generations of struggle throughout all these years, throughout all these people over this span of time that made it possible. And maybe, if you went back to the people who were first starting some of the ideas, right? Like if you started at abolitionism, for instance, about abolishing slavery, during their lifetime, there probably was not the hope that things would change, but they kept doing the work anyways. It kept moving towards a different direction. Things got progressively better, but it might not have been perfect in their time. But then you look overarching, all of this time span, things were changing towards the right direction, and then at a certain point, things kind of exploded. There was a lot of societal changes and societal circumstances that people in the past had no idea would even come to fruition, who had no idea what that reality would look like. And so you can kind of see things changing throughout many people's lives, throughout multiple generations of people struggling throughout time and then eventually getting there. So that's kind of what I kind of see it as being is, with hope, you keep going. There's the possibilities start turning into probabilities, and those probabilities start turning into realities very, very quickly. And the key thing is to keep that going, keep that force, keep that idea moving towards the right direction, and then eventually, fingers crossed, things work out.
Like if we use the analogy of realism, there were people, certainly in the context of the UK, when abolitionism became a topic of conversation, let's say, that would have this, I don't know if they use the specific term, but in modern parlance, they would use the term of like, they are the realists. It's not something that we can do immediately because obviously so much of the economy depends on it, etc., etc. And in fact, I would argue, again, to push that same like to its logical end, in a sense that I don't know if you know this, but I'm assuming you do, but like the UK government or the British Empire at the time, part of how slavery was abolished, that there was a law that was passed to compensate slave owners and not obviously the enslaved peoples. And it was just about a decade ago, I believe, like a date that's very ridiculously recent, where the interests of those payments were paid off by the UK state. I really do mean a decade ago. It's like literally, that's not an exaggeration. So within the logic of even the legal abolition of slavery in the context of the UK, I would be surprised if this was different elsewhere. But that's the example that I know, like France or whatever. The logic is that you cannot just deprive these people of private property, because that's what legally enslaved people were to the white slavers, of course, because that would upend everything we think about regarding private properties if the state can just change it overnight. So there were these entire legal debates and whatnot, and the compromise, quote unquote, that was met is that slavery gets abolished. There's a very, if I remember which ones they are, I will link them. A very good few episodes of the Empire podcast that talks about that, which is a really good podcast. I recommend as well. The compromise, if you want, is that we won't do we're not like radicals, quote unquote, like John Brown or whatever. We're going to be the middle path or whatever. Slavery, okay, we've agreed. The moral debate has been won. It is a bad thing, clearly bad. But we have to think about, us, the detached adults, and think about the economy, blah, blah, blah. we have to think about what does that mean in terms of money? What does it mean in terms of whatever, etc., etc. And that's essentially what ends up happening. If you think of just like the logic that was embedded in that decision and the repercussions that that has had, and to the point that, as I said, it's just a few years ago where those payments were paid off. If that logic was not embedded, if that story was not told in that way and accepted at the highest levels of government, how much more money could we have had today as a nation? But I'm saying it like this, but like in the sense that literally resources and money and whatnot can be spent and wasted and whatnot on behalf of effectively an ideology that masquerades itself as quote unquote realistic, right? And that's just like one example. A pretty bad one, I would say, but it is one of those things that's pretty mind-boggling for those who don't know the details. I'll find that those articles, I'll put them in the show notes. I'll end now. Luka mentioned earlier before we started recording, it reminded me that in the early days of this podcast, I used to ask folks to have like 3 books recommendation in the end, and I haven't done this in a while, but I completely forgot to tell Luka about this. So what I'm going to do as a compromise, if you guys want, is I'll mention a book that 2 books actually that I've been reading. One is called Fearless, Sleepless, Deathless by Maria Pinto. The subtitle of that book is long, but it's What Fungi Taught Me About Nourishment, Poison, Ecology, Hidden Histories, Zombies, and Black Survival. It's an amazing subtitle. And it's a fascinating book, like a series of essays in which I think they go by they, I'm not sure. They talk about the relation like with fungi and what it's taught them, but like in a very I hate to use this term given everything we've said about that term, but in a very quote unquote realistic way. It's poetic, it's creative, it's sort of that thing, but it's also like this is why this matters. I'm going to explain it to you, in that sense. And the other book that I'll recommend is actually the second part. It's like a duology by a Anishinaabe writer actually called I'm gonna butcher Wobgeshik Rice. I think famous in Canada, but my first name, I'm bad.
Rice. You said it right.
Perfect. Is Moon of the Custard Snow, which is the second part of that duology. The first one is called Moon of the Turning Leaves. And for those who don't know,
the second one is Moon of the Turning Leaves. The first one is
yes, you're right. You're right. Thank you. So I'm reading the second one now. And the story, I mean, I'm just literally in the wiki summary, but the story is pretty straightforward. It's like it's set in a rural Anishinaabe community in what's now northern Canada, and it follows a group of community members, and here I'm reading from the Wikipedia, after they are cut off from the rest of the world amidst a societal collapse. We don't have details about that societal collapse. It's like in the first few pages, something happened, but there is basically an apocalypse. And the story is actually what happens in that community of the Anishinaabe folks in what's now northern Canada. It's a fascinating read because it's technically like it's a dystopia. I mean, it's in the context of a dystopia, but it's also about community, literally like people who are connecting to their roots at some point. Like I'm not gonna spoil it or anything, but like things happen and like very tough questions are asked, but fundamentally the kind of the motivating philosophy, through line, whatever, if you want, is that the question is like what can we do to survive as a community? Not what can I do or whatever, but literally that's like the question that's being asked. It's a fascinating read. My only critique would be in the context of what we've been talking about is that, as I said, it's in the context of a societal collapse. There is no details on it. Something happens, as I said, it's like in the beginning of the book. And my critique would be that like I want to know what it is, because my hunch is that I would probably disagree that what caused it would lead to societal collapse, if that makes sense, based on what we're talking about. But it's okay. That's it's a stylistic decision because that was not important. The point is what was important was for the author was to see like how a society like his, because he's from that community, would cope in a situation like this using the tools that he already knew. And there's a lot of stories and culture and speaking to the ancestors, all of that stuff, which makes for a fascinating read, especially for someone like me who's not from that community. So I would recommend that one. Any final thoughts, things you want to throw at the world? Where can folks follow you? What are you doing? Books you want to recommend? I don't know, whatever. Go for it.
Well, none of the
go ahead.
I was just gonna say Moon of the Crusted Snow almost made my list, so I'm glad you covered that one. I would of course recommend Utopia and the Age of Survival. I think it speaks to a lot of what we talked about today. It's a very interesting, winding read. I feel like I'm being led through a field of tall grass at night, and she's just got this lantern and keeps like switching back on our trail, and I'm like, where are we going? But like everywhere we go is interesting, so that's fine. Yeah, I have the Solarpunk Now podcast. I'm doing my ethnography of the Solarpunk community, so my survey for that will be out for a while. I also wanted to recommend Begonia. It was just a really good movie. If anyone is a Yorgos Lanthimos fan or likes just weird, fucked up movies, I was really struck by it's not a hopeful movie, but it is really empathetic. I was really struck by the through line of empathy because I feel like a lot of films coming out right now that I would otherwise really enjoy are have a very like dark perspective on human nature, and this one was a very dark story told very lovingly, I would say. And that's what I have for now. I'll leave it at that.
Nice. In the vein of recommending a theory book and then a fiction book, I'm currently reading The Mushroom at the End of the World: A Life in Capitalist Ruins. And I'm not super far into the book yet. I've only done the first couple of chapters, but it's really, really interesting. It's kind of like creative nonfiction almost. She's weaving scholarship and also the history of the place that she's in, and the histories of maitake, mushroom foraging and stuff like that, and the ways that we can learn from mushrooms and fungus and all that kind of stuff. And also, I've been reading, well, I just finished actually, We Speak Through the Mountain by Premi Mohammed, which is the second in the series that starts with the annual migration of clouds. And it's set in Edmonton, Alberta, after an apocalypse. Again, I mean, like we don't get to see the apocalypse happening, but she is very, I mean, the focal character is very like blunt about it's, like from her perspective, it was just basically the worsening of climate collapse. And then, rich people did the bunker thing and left everybody else to just kind of figure it out. But also, there's an alien, possibly. Maybe it came from the deep sea. Maybe it came from a melting ice cap. Who knows? But it just made everything else worse so that nobody could figure out how to mitigate all these climate disasters because they were too busy trying to figure out how to mitigate this sort of fungal infection, quote unquote, that was sort of like ripping through the populace. And it's been described as a hope punk book because it is very focused on community and the ways that you survive through community, even in a terrible situation. It's not like got rose-colored glasses about community. There are people that suck in the community, and she just has to deal with it. And they have to, find a way to get along because their survival depends on, like getting along with people who don't necessarily have the same viewpoint as you and are just terrible to be around. So, I don't know, I really like that part as well because I see lots of narratives of community they're very sunny and cheerful and wonderful and it's great, but it's also, some people can be people. So, you can find more of me, I guess, at Ariel.02.ca, and there's a list of my publications and Solarpunk things that I've been involved in. The podcast is solarpunkpresents.com, or you can get it on your podcatcher of choice. We're on hiatus right now, but hopefully we'll be back soon.
Awesome. Yeah, I've got some book recommendations. They're nonfiction, which people should not think nonfiction books are boring. They're very, very good, especially when they touch on parts of your life. When I was kind of going through a lot in life, I read Byung-Chul Han's The Burnout Society, and it kind of touches on a lot of what we talked about, kind of living in a society where you're kind of only living to survive, and what does that look like? Kind of goes into some background on burnout and how we've kind of moved from a society of discipline, is what Michel Foucault kind of called it, into a society of achievement. So people are kind of self-embodying their own chains around, telling themselves, I have to do all this stuff to achieve this, that, and the other. When in reality, life is a lot more than what you can achieve and what you can do. That kind of led into another book by Byung-Chul Han called The Spirit of Hope. Obviously pertains a lot to our conversation here, and kind of talking more about hope, what it leads to, and how to keep it and how to grow it. It's been really, really good in changing my outlook with my own work and with other works of fiction. So it's definitely pushed me past burnout into, a whole new area of life where I feel like I'm getting back into the groove of things. But I can't remember where I saw it, but there was a quote that basically said that, in our lives we all have seasons. Sometimes that season is winter. But after winter comes spring, and with spring comes growth, comes, the revitalization of life. So even though you might be going through, kind of a dark time, it might be winter for you, but spring is on the way, and things will grow and things will get better. So with that, I'm trying to work on kind of revitalizing a lot of my writing, rethinking a lot of my videos and stuff. So mostly post. You can see kind of my stuff on hydroponictrash.solar, and on my Substack, anarchosolarpunk.substack.com. I'm going to be going through a lot of my old work and redoing it, updating some stuff, and kind of pushing ahead. And my last recommendation, David Graeber's The Dawn of Everything. I think I've recommended this before, but highly, highly, highly recommend it. Kind of touches on a lot of the topics that we talked about today. And I mean, the quote from him, from David Graeber: "The ultimate hidden truth about the world is that it's something that we make and could just as easily make differently." And the whole book goes into questioning, why do we have these narratives about what's quote unquote reality right now, and what led to this point, and rethinking, okay, maybe the histories that we're kind of taught aren't necessarily the real histories of how we got here. So it talks a lot about the history of democracy and where some of the influences came from, indigenous people in North America, and how their ideas of society, how society runs, directly influenced some of the European philosophers that kind of quote unquote created democracy. And so far over history, it's been, hey, white people created democracy, but is that true? And it kind of goes into that. So really, really changed my perspective on a lot of different things. But that's it for me.
Awesome. I'll quickly add a book called Goliath's Curse by Luke Kemp, which I've been reading. It's kind of a good companion to the two Davids who wrote Dawn of Everything. It's called Goliath's Curse: The History and Future of Societal Collapse. Came out last year, I think. I'm going to try and have a moment at some point. But it also talks about, it's very similar themes to what Andre just mentioned. Goes further on some things and not, whatever, as books are. So I recommend that one. On that note, everyone, everything we've said will be in the show notes. And all that's left for me to do is to thank you all for doing this.
Well, thank you for bringing us all together. This was wonderful.
A lovely reunion. Thank you.
Yeah.